Majority Leader Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the Senate proceed out of order for consideration of memorials.
The motion is to proceed out of order for the consideration of memorials. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is adopted. We will now proceed out of order. Consideration of memorials. Will the clerk please read the title of Senate Joint Memorial 3?
Senate Joint Memorial 3 by Senator Gonzalez and Representatives Gonzalez Gutierrez memorializing former Representative and Senator Dennis Gallagher.
Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Senate Joint Memorial 3 and request that it be read at length.
Will the clerk please read Senate Joint Memorial 3 at length?
Senate Joint Memorial 3 by Senator Gonzalez and Representative Gonzalez Gutierrez, memorializing former Representative and Senator Dennis Gallagher. Whereas the Honorable Dennis Joseph Patrick Gallagher departed this life on April 22, 2022, at the age of 82. And whereas the Honorable Gallagher was a beloved past member of the Colorado House of Representatives from 1970 to 1974, and the Colorado Senate from 1974 to 1995, served on the Denver City Council from 1995 to 2003, and was elected as auditor for the City and County of Denver, serving from 2003 until 2015. And whereas former Senator Gallagher was born in 1939 in Denver, Colorado, to first-generation Irish-American mother and father Nellie Flaherty and William Gallagher Jr., and attended Holy Family High School in North Denver. And whereas former Senator Gallagher's life was transformed by the Sisters of Loretto at Holy Family High School in North Denver, whose coaching led him to achieve the distinction of national runner-up in the Voice of Democracy oratorial contest. And whereas Senator Gallagher went on to a Catholic university in Washington, D.C. on a J.K. Mullen scholarship, where he received graduate degrees in speech, linguistics, and comparative philology, and wrote a thesis on a 1399 Cornish medieval miracle play. And whereas it was during his time in Washington that former Senator Gallagher worked on campaigns for John F. Kennedy and, quote, felt the warmth of John F. Kennedy's torch, unquote. And whereas former Senator Gallagher was an important figure in the Irish community in Denver, hosting a well-known St. Patrick's Day celebration, as well as co-authoring the book Irish Denver, Images of America, with his friends Tom Noel and James Patrick Walsh. And whereas former Senator Gallagher was perhaps best known for the amendment named after him, the Gallagher Amendment, which passed the legislature in 1982 and was intended to lower residential property taxes. And whereas former Senator Gallagher worked with Mayor John Hickenlooper, who he helped get his start in politics, to spearhead the complete reformation of the Denver Auditor's Office, which expanded the purview of the office and allowed for performance-based audits. And whereas Senator Gallagher was a devoted public servant who worked well with everyone around him, and who was known by his constituents to be an approachable and visible legislator who could be seen walking his districts and stopping to talk with whomever he ran into, introducing himself. He impressed foreign visitors by greeting them in their native language, amazingly in 23 different languages. He also astonished tourists and locals by bursting into the Colorado state song, A.J. Flynn's Where the Columbines Grow, and always reminded people, you have to ask for the vote. And whereas former Senator Gallagher was known for his personal motto, which was Athenian in origin and came from his love of the classics, quote, leave the city a better place than you found it, unquote. And as Tom Noel's heartfelt tribute to him said, quote, with Dennis gone, who will enlighten city council and legislative journals with quotations from poets such as William Shakespeare and Gerard Manley Hopkins? Dennis was a hopeless bibliophile who never passed up a book sale or a library. Every book is a sacred obligation, he loved to say. Not only the people of Denver, but thousands of students at Regis University, where Dennis taught speech, persuasion, and media for almost 50 years, will miss him. He especially loved the summer classes he took to Ireland. To those who think no politician can be honest, Dennis Gallagher was the answer, unquote. And whereas it is fitting that we, the members of the 74th General Assembly, pay tribute to the dedicated service of Dennis Joseph Patrick Gallagher and express our deep regret and sorrow occasioned by his death, now therefore be it resolved by the Senate of the 74th General Assembly of the State of Colorado, the House of Representatives concurring herein, that in the death of the Honorable Dennis Joseph Patrick Gallagher, the people of Colorado have lost a dedicated public servant and outstanding citizen, and that we, the members of the 74th General Assembly, do hereby extend our deep and heartfelt sympathy to the members of his family and pay tribute to a man who served his state well and faithfully. Be it further resolved that copies of this joint memorial be sent to Danny Gallagher, his son, and Tim Gallagher, his brother.
Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, please be seated. They simply don't make them like Dennis Gallagher anymore. What an honor and a joy to be able to be visited today by so many friends and family, by so many former colleagues. Dennis Gallagher was an institution in Denver politics and in Colorado politics. I hope that this institution carries on his legacy, because Lord knows we need more Shakespeare and fewer limericks. But being able to find common ground, even in the midst of deep dispute, deep crisis, being able to come together, whether it's across a love of learning, whether or not it's across a specific policy, whether or not it's around love of Ireland and culture, whether or not it's across love of this city. They just don't make them like Dennis Gallagher anymore. I want to acknowledge Danny Gallagher, his son. If you'd please stand. Tim Gallagher and his wife, Sherry Peterson Gallagher. Richard and Colleen Clem. I'd also like to acknowledge Joanne Gallagher, his former wife. I'd also like to acknowledge his friends of the family, Mark Barnhouse, Jim Kroll, Dr. Tom Knoll, also known as Dr. Colorado, Gary Sully, Clay Vigoda, Paul McLaughlin, Sister Mary Nell Gage, and Kate Springs. Thank you all for joining us here today. I want to start off by acknowledging you, because we'll be hearing beautiful stories from his former colleagues and from those of us here in this chamber as well. But colleagues, please, let's begin by giving them a round of applause.
Senator Winter.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first met Dennis Gallagher around 2006, and I'm an Adams County Democrat, and he always came to our St. Patrick's Day celebration. So I was young, and I was wanting to do something in politics, and I was talking to folks about what I needed to do. And they were like, you have to make corned beef for the St. Patrick's Day celebration. And I thought, I've never made corned beef in my life. I am a little bit Irish, but I never made corned beef. So I did all the research. I looked at all the recipes. And they're like, and you need to win over Dennis Gallagher. I was like, okay, here we go. First, Adams County St. Patrick's Day celebration, I have 2 jobs. I'm gonna make corned beef and I'm gonna win over Dennis Gallagher. And he always came to the Adams County St. Patrick's Day celebration, even though he had his own great party in Denver. And I don't know if I'm giving away a secret, but he always said he wishes he was an Adams County Democrat when he came to our parties. And so I'm here and I'm 26 and I have corned beef. I'm like, hi, I'm Faith. And talked to him about who I was, and he tried my corned beef, and he's like, you're gonna go places. I approve of your corned beef. And, and that's when I knew that I could make it in Adams County politics, because Dennis Gallagher approved of my corned beef. And fast forward to today, I sit in desk number 13, which Dennis Gallagher sat in for 20 years. So I have a big seat to fill every single day because of the heart and the compassion and all the energy he gave to this office. He woke up every single day with so much joy in serving the people, and I knew immediately from the first time I met him and throughout his life that I wanted to have that joy and that passion for serving people. And then today, I found out even more about him through Danny Gallagher, which makes me feel even more connected. So Danny was talking about how he would come here as a child while his dad sat in desk number 13. And you all have seen my children come here and run this building. They get all the lobbyists to buy them candy and cookies in the basement and go to the cafeteria and run up to the dome and talk to all the sergeants. And hearing the stories that Danny shared today about his childhood and how that brought him here today, sharing that with his dad. And so may we all be more like Dennis Gallagher, filled with joy and compassion and love of corned beef.
Senator Zenzinger.
Thank you, Mr. President. Members, I first got to know Senator Gallagher as a student at Regis University. I grew up on the western slope, so I had no idea that he was a big deal. And I, just in full confession, I'm kind of a night person and I hate mornings, and I really did not want to take an 8 o'clock communications class. So I scanned the booklet to find my required communications class, and I found a 6 p.m. class in the evening with Senator Dennis Gallagher. And I thought, yeah, I'll do that. It's way better than getting up early. But I didn't know what I was signing up for, because it was much more than a communications class. It was a history of Denver class. It was a history of the Colorado legislature class. It was a history, a walking tour of the cemeteries of Denver class. It was a poetry class. It was a calligraphy class. It was a class on Ignatian spirituality. It was a class on Jesuits and their impact on education. It was a mind-blowingly interesting class, and I never took anything like it again at Regis University. And I just didn't know what I was getting myself in for. While I was at Regis, I started taking an interest in politics, and we went to Senator Gallagher because we were interested in starting a College Democrats chapter at Regis University. And he became our official faculty advisor for the very first College Democrats chapter at Regis University. And he was very positive, encouraging. We would meet and he would give us tips on how to debate. And of course, we never actually got to talk, though, because he talked the entire time. He did all the debating, both pro and con, and we just sat there and listened to him. Of course, he always started every debate and every class with a poem, usually from one of the greats. We would also talk about James Joyce and Gerard Manley Hopkins, and he would oftentimes recite this poetry with an Irish accent, and he would make sure to put the title and the author up on the board in the most beautiful calligraphy that you can imagine, and he would always start every class that way. And so you could usually count on not having to worry about assignments or homework for a good 25 minutes because we would just start off class with recitations. But it was a lovely way to begin class because it grounded you in beautiful things. And he really was very proud of his Irish ancestry and then his knowledge of Denver and his love for all things Jesuit. I just wanted to leave you with this two lines from a poem that he recited from memory, of course. I couldn't recite any of these things from memory, but he always did. And it's called God's Grandeur. It's a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, an Irish poet who became a Jesuit. And it says, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness, like the ooze of oil crushed." And then it goes on to talk about how it will never go away, that God's grandeur is always there. And that's kind of how I feel about Dennis Gallagher, is that even though he's not here, he's still present, and he will always be there, just like God's grandeur inside of us. And I can always imagine him shining out like shook foil because that's the kind of personality that he was.
Senator Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to share just a couple of quick thoughts with you this morning as we memorialize an incredible public servant. Think about it for just a second. 1970 to 2015. 45 years of service to this state and to this city. That's pretty incredible. Obviously, with term limits, we're not going to see too many of those things get repeated here in Denver or anywhere else in Colorado. But what incredible dedication. And if each of us in this room as elected officials, whether we've been here for a few months or for a few years, take a moment and a deep breath to think about 45 years of that approach to service and that dedication. It's incredible, and I'm so glad today we get a chance to honor it and remember his incredible legacy. And also, what kind of person would want to go from the state capitol to the city hall? That is crazy. That is absolutely crazy. The last thought I'll share with you is my most intense interaction with Senator Gallagher was in the debate about the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment. And I was one of the co-sponsors of the resolution that put that on the ballot and then became part of the campaign to the people of Colorado to make a change to our Constitution. And that was not an easy campaign. And perhaps the most unenviable part of that for me was having to debate Senator Gallagher on TV or on radio or in a public forum. And I was always nervous doing so. But the thing I remember so clearly is that there were some of those debates that got personal. I got called nasty things for being part of the effort to repeal the Gallagher Amendment. Personal attacks in some of those debates, but never from Senator Gallagher. Never. And it was named after him. It would have been pretty easy to take that personally, and he never did. And we each time had a very thorough debate about the pros and cons of should this remain in the Constitution, because that's what the debate was about. And I'll never forget that. Even the guy who it was named after never made a personal attack in those debates. And so today I join this chamber in honoring him, remembering his legacy, the 45 years of dedicated service to the state and to the city. And I'm so glad that I had a chance to get to know Senator Gallagher.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. President. When my kids were born, I kind of made it my goal to teach them what it meant to be Irish. And I read all of the books and passed on everything that I had, learned about it. And certainly living here in Denver, if you were Irish in Denver, you know who Senator Gallagher was. And you would see and hear about him. And I saw him many times before I actually got an opportunity to meet him. And the last time that I met him and spent some time with him, there was a Irish miners memorial that's being built up in Leadville. And I went on a bus trip up there for the opening. And it was the period, the 6 months before St. Patrick's Day was when they had it. So we were on the bus together, and there weren't very many people on the bus, which was kind of nice, and got opportunities to talk with. And as you will all attest to, as you just drove by places, he would shout out, what the significance of that building was, or what that plane was, or whatever was going on. And I remember when I first walked up to him and I went to introduce myself, he said, "Oh, yeah, I know who you are." And I was dumbfounded. I was just like, how does this guy know me? And we actually they have in Leadville on that 6 months before St. Patrick's Day, that's when they have their parade. Because history tells us that back in the day on St. Patrick's Day in Leadville, they would normally be under 20 or 30 inches of snow, and so they couldn't have the parade on St. Patrick's Day when everybody else did, so they would have it during the summer, the 6 months before. So I actually got to walk down the half a block or whatever it was that it was with Senator Gallagher. And as we were going, I kind of lost track of him, and I don't know where he went. And then I finished up at the end of the parade, and there's, of course, a couple of pubs and drinking establishments along the way. And I walked into one of them, and there was the senator, and he was doing, and I'm sure you all know this certainly better than I do, he was kind of holding court. He was there, and there was a crowd of people around him, and I just thought, yeah, that's probably the way it should be. So thank you so much for, sharing him with me, and enjoy the rest of your great St. Patrick's Day.
Majority Leader Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. President. Pursuant to Senate Rule 31A, I move that the Senate stand in recess for the purpose of allowing former members to address the body.
The Senate will now stand in a brief recess to allow former members of the House and Senate to address the body. Will the distinguished former members of this institution, if you'd like to say a few words, you're free to join us in the well. Senator Blickensderfer.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members of the body. I have seen many of you more often than I really want to as we lose many of our great leaders. I guess I should start off by stating the obvious, that everybody has a Dennis Gallagher story. He personified Denver and did it in such a graceful and, well, awfully humorous fashion in some respects. Whether he was hosting the very sought-after St. Patrick's Day party, or attending lunch at the Cactus Club with the likes of Tom Noel or Leo Boyle, he always enjoyed a good joke and a story. And during the reading of the of the resolution, there was mention of how he would revel in greeting visiting legislators, many from Eastern European countries, and would come down to the microphone and greet them supposedly in their native tongue. Well, we all kind of tested that once, and he was up greeting them in the back and then came down and gave his greeting at the microphone, and a few of us snuck down, and having talked to the legislators who were here, and we came to this microphone and said, "Senator, they don't know what you just said." Yeah, it was just sort of fun to pull that on him. And of course, you know how Dennis would take it. He just rolled over in laughter. But despite his very funny and somewhat raucous side, he served as the conscience of this body. I believe, and I know Tom Noel can confirm or deny this, I believe Dennis's parents, his father was a firefighter, if I'm not mistaken. And I remember our debating a variety of pieces of legislation related to the working men and women of this state. And Dennis would always come down to this microphone and remind us of the kinds of things that they would face, especially those in high-risk positions. And it was just so refreshing and so worthwhile to have that contribution to the debate. Dennis always had a heart-rending story. And of course, as has been mentioned already, who of us can claim to have a state constitutional amendment named after us? God bless you, Dennis Gallagher.
Senator Hernandez.
Thank you, Mr. President, members of the body. Benjamin Franklin said, "Don't wish so much to live long as to live well." And I think we can all agree that Senator Gallagher lived well. And of course, I had a speech prepared, and I thought, no. There's going to be plenty of people saying these wonderful things about Dennis, because there's, I mean, you know, being a former senator, I can go on and on and on, but I won't. So I'll give you two very good personal observations that I had about Dennis. I was still in high school when Dennis was elected to the House, and one Christmas he came to our house, because we lived by Sloan's Lake at the time, and knocked on the door and burst into Christmas carols in Latin, of all things, and he knew the words, and not the first phrase, but I think it was Adeste Fidelis. And my little brothers were just jumping up and down. They were so excited. They were maybe 7 and 8 at the time. But he wasn't dressed as Santa Claus. He looked like a bishop. And my little brother said, "Well, who are you?" And he said, "Well, I'm Saint Nick." And, you know, they knew. They were thinking Santa Claus at the time. And my parents were gone. But Dennis was going around the neighborhood. So when my parents came home, my little brothers are jumping up and down. You know, but there was this man was here. And they said, "Oh, you mean Dennis?" "Oh, no, it was a saint." "Well, how do you know?" "Because he told us he was a saint." And the other thing, what that says how good Dennis was with children and the positive impact that he would leave with young minds. And the other story that I want to tell you about is that you know how it is when you're walking around the chambers and you're going from committee room to committee room, and guess what happens? And there's just a whole bunch of little ones that are touring the building from this school or that school. So one time, Dennis and I were walking through the hallway. We were talking about a bill or something, and so Dennis and I stopped. And next thing I observed is this little tyke tugged at his pant legs and said, "Are you anybody important around here?" And Dennis said, "Well, it depends upon who you talk to." He said, "Well, my dad said I have to talk to somebody important." And so Dennis said, "Well, I'll give you my card." And so he started to sign it in, you know, his autograph and calligraphy. Well, as Dennis was signing this card, you could see all of these kids lined up. It was about 30 of them. They all wanted the same card. This teacher is just beside herself. And Dennis said, And I thought, well, Dennis is going to be late for committee, but he took the time. It isn't so much that he was on time for committee, but he took the time with all those young people. I bet you one or two of them still probably remember to this day meeting Senator Gallagher, because they have that card that he signed in his name. So I guess we can all agree that Dennis, you know, not only did he live long, but he lived well, and he was good with children. Thank you.
Senator Sandoval.
I have a soft voice. Oh, that came out loud. So Dennis Gallagher, what a wonderful memorial for him. You heard his titles: state representative, state senator, city councilman, city auditor. But he was also a teacher, professor, tour guide, statesman, thespian, historian, author, newspaper columnist, calligrapher, and most recently, podcaster, and also star of a documentary. But the best roles of all were a son, brother, brother-in-law, cousin, uncle, husband, father, neighbor, and friend. The last of which he was a friend to many, and many were blessed to call him a friend. It was said that he was a true Renaissance man, and I've heard that term thrown around quite a bit lately, but I really think Dennis fit the definition, as he was proficient in so many areas. He often quoted Shakespeare, as was mentioned before, and his favorite author, James Joyce. He recited phrases in Latin, and then, of course, translated them for you. He has also been described as the consummate public servant. He certainly had that prerequisite that everybody in public life should possess, and that is he liked and cared about people. He cared about his community, his city, his state. He was ardent and passionate about causes he cared about, especially the Gallagher Amendment, and not because it bore his name, but because it allowed citizens, in particular seniors, whose biggest asset is most certainly the home they owned. It allowed them to be able to stay in their home and not be forced out because of exorbitant taxes. Dennis Gallagher's heart was in the right place on that one. Dennis Gallagher was a champion of the people, and he used his status and influence that he acquired over the years, his platform in today's speak, to advocate for those whose voice would not otherwise be heard. One thing, on a personal note, that I remember about Dennis at my restaurant, the man could eat hot chili. And sometimes the person that you least expect to be able to eat hot chili is the one that can stand it the best, and others that you expect to eat hot chili, they're real wusses about it. Well, Dennis was in that category, although once in a while I did detect a bead of sweat coming down the side of his forehead. Dennis was a friend to so many. You know, the day before his funeral, I was invited to an old-fashioned Irish wake at Dennis's house, and I really did not know what to expect. And my first hint should have been when I couldn't find parking, but I always envisioned that it would be this small group of people, and we would sit around in a circle, and we would tell stories about Dennis. But when I got there, it was like standing room only. It was filled with people. There was a table laden with food and drink, and of course there were Irish dishes there, and I imagine that they were Dennis's favorite dishes. There was a live Irish chamber music, and a good time was had by all. And yes, we reminisced about Dennis Gallagher, but we also celebrated a life well lived. Another thing about Dennis's house, he had this door that he had imported from Ireland. And while some people have a housewarming, Dennis had a door warming. And he invited folks over to breakfast to celebrate his new door. He had a priest from Regis bless the door, not his house, but the door. And I can see why, because it really was a nice door. Dennis's premier event for constituents and friends was his annual St. Patrick's Day celebration. And if you were a politician, you did not dare miss that event, as it was very well attended, and Dennis was sure to introduce you to the crowd. Even if he wasn't supporting you, he graciously let you speak at that event. It allowed all of us to be Irish for a day, eating corned beef and cabbage, those of us that aren't vegetarians. And speaking of the political scene, if Dennis decided to support you for whatever office that you were running for, he was all in. He would handwrite in that beautiful calligraphy of his postcards to everyone he knew to ask them to support your candidacy. Dennis left behind scores of friends and family, friends too numerous to call out lest I slight someone in leaving them out. Besides his other extended family, he left behind his brother Tim and Tim's wife Sherry, his former wife Joanne, his son Danny, whom he loved unconditionally. However, sadly, his beloved daughter Megan preceded him in death. One day, it was just about a year ago, a weary Dennis Gallagher lay down to take a nap, and he never woke up. And in the words of his favorite author, James Joyce, his soul swooned softly as he heard the snow falling faintly through the universe, and faintly falling like the descent of their last end upon all the living and the dead. Dennis Gallagher spent a good portion of his adult life here in this chamber and in these hallowed halls of the state capitol. On behalf of his family and friends, thank you for honoring him today.
Senator Tate.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning. Many people have said many things about Dennis Gallagher, and the most remarkable thing I can say is they're all true. Dennis never knew a stranger. But the most remarkable thing is people who knew Dennis always knew Dennis. When I met him, I was a young man, and he came to my neighborhood, Northeast Denver, at the invitation of Wilma Webb, Wellington Webb, Regis Groff, Gloria Tanner, and a host of other people. And I'm like, who is this guy? And they're like, well, he's Mr. Northside. That's kind of how they introduced him. And I got to meet him and came up and introduced myself, and he said, I know your dad. And he said, I'm Dennis. He didn't preface it with a title. He didn't talk about what position he held or had held. He just said, I'm Dennis. And that's what I remember most about him. He was a person who, as you've heard, accomplished so much, did so many things, served our community in so many ways, but fundamentally, at the end of the day, he was Dennis. And that's how people knew him. In addition to everything you've heard, what I remember most about Dennis is that he was a sharing man. He gave a lot. And a lot of what he gave was advice. And I was the beneficiary of it on 2 occasions I'll never forget. I had the opportunity to serve on Governor Romer's cabinet, and on one occasion I appeared before the audit committee, and Dennis was on the committee, and it was a contentious situation because the auditor was upset that I had done some things in running my department that the auditor didn't agree with. And I was trying to explain to the committee why it was okay that I disagreed with the auditor and everything was going to be all right. And Dennis, when he had an opportunity, spoke and said, Mr. Tate, that's all right, because 'tis better to ask for forgiveness than permission. I never forgot that. And he was right. The second piece of advice he gave me, and the one I really took to heart, was when I had the privilege of being elected by the folks in District 8 to serve in the House, in House District 8, I had a chance to visit with Dennis. And he was one of the people I went to for advice, and I said, okay, what do I need to know going into this deal? And he said, you've got to remember 3 things. Always represent and vote your district and your constituents, number 1. Number 2, always respect your values and your principles. And number 3, never surprise leadership. And I always took that to heart. We're in an era where I sometimes worry that we don't see enough statesmen and stateswomen rising to the level of a Dennis Gallagher. We sometimes have lost the ability to disagree without being disagreeable. Dennis showed us that you have to do that. It's just a bill. You win some, you lose some, you move on to the next one. But what matters most is what's in the best interest of the people you represent. And in these chambers, it's the people of the state of Colorado. Danny, I will miss your dad. He was a wonderful guy. He was a mentor. He was a friend. And he was really a state treasure. And thank you for the time you and the family let him spend serving with and working with all of us. Thank you.
Representative Pabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Friends, that's how Dennis Gallagher would start every speech he would give, whether it was in front of a church, a spaghetti dinner, or the state senate. That was part of the full phrase was friends, Romans, countrymen. And it just, you knew the moment he said that something great was going to be said, something funny was going to be said. You stood up in attention. And he had this marvelous gift of 2 things. No matter what crowd he was in front of, he could grab your attention. You would stop what you were doing and listen. And then, when the speech was over and it was time to walk out or move on to the next thing, he would come to you if he went to you, and he would make you feel like you were the most important person on the planet. He did those 2 things so well all the time. And as a young man in North Denver, learning about the world, learning about politics, learning about how to be a good public servant, man, those were big shoes that you had to fill if you were ever going to be a North Denver public servant. Senator Gonzalez, you know exactly what I'm talking about. All of us, we know that those were big shoes to fill. And he was a marvelous mentor. And what's so gratifying about being here today with our old North Denver crew and those who've been part of our North Denver crew is his advice and his challenge never changed over the generations. The same things he told Senator Tate was what he told me when I thought about running for office. He didn't care about the policies that I was going to run. He didn't care about the political views as long as I was a Democrat. He said, make sure you always vote your district, stand with your constituents, and no matter what happens in that chamber, no matter what happens in your district, never, ever forget where you came from. Always be humble. Always be kind. Always listen to all opinions, Democrat, Republican, rich, poor, anyone from anywhere, because they've always got something to offer you. I'll just tell you one quick political story. I don't know if it's appropriate for the Senate, but it would have been in the House. So North Denver, if you know North Denver, you love North Denver. And you know that it's an anchor in the city and always has been, in large part because of Dennis Gallagher. But from time to time, there'd be other factions inside of North Denver who would run against each other, run candidates against each other, to settle scores, to set differences, to do all the things that North Denver was always famous for. And you always wanted to be sure that if you were on one side, and sometimes Senator Gallagher was on one side and there was a whole bunch of folks on the other side, that the one side didn't know that you were talking to the other side. And as a young man getting ready to run for office, we had a couple of different sides in North Denver at the time. There was the Dennis Gallagher side, and there was the Don Mades side. And never the two shall meet. And if you know anything about that history, you know that that was a long history. But when I was running for office, and I went to Senator Gallagher, and by the way, it wasn't just Senator Gallagher, it was Gary Sully and Dennis Bergfeld and Play Vigoda and the whole crew. And that was a very scary breakfast to be with all of those very influential people. And I think we've all done that if we've ever run for office in Denver. And asked for Senator Gallagher's support. And I reminded him that we had a lot in common, which we didn't really at all. I mean, he was a giant. I'm this, little Hispanic kid trying to run for office in North Denver. But I said, one of the things we have is we both went to Holy Family High School. We were both graduates of Holy Family. And the same values that you learned about the community, I learned. And, with that and a few promises I hope that I kept, I got his support. And then I went to the other side and said similar things and had similar connections. Don Mades didn't go to Holy Family, he went to Regis. And I asked him for his support, and he said yes. And so in the middle of a very hotly contested primary, I asked both of them, would you be willing to put your names side by side on an email for me, endorsing me for State House? And they both said, we're bearing the hatchet. We've never agreed on anything in 20 years. We're agreeing on you as the candidate for State House. And it was one of the most honorable moments that I've ever had to see two giants in this area lend their support to the next generation, because they believed that mentorship and the next generation was more important than the battles of the past. And I'll never forget that. I'll never forget that time, because again, literally, they had not agreed on anything for years until that time. The one thing that I will always remember about Senator Gallagher was when he was auditor, and you may have received one of these cards, he would hand you his card, and he'd say, let me know if you see anything suspicious out there. I'll follow up on it. And he did, and he followed up, and he audited that city to the disbelief of the mayor and every council member in the city. He protected the people. He protected the institutions. He protected the world that we lived in because he cared so much. And so I'll end by just saying, Senator Gallagher, Auditor Gallagher, Councilman Gallagher, Representative Gallagher, you always said, leave the city, the state, the country better than you found it. And I will say, Godspeed, Senator Gallagher. You left the world better than you found it.
Thank you to the former members and distinguished and honorable folks who serve this institution and come back and speak those kind words about Dennis Gallagher. And also thank you, Dan Pabon, for coming too. The Senate will come back to order. Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I said earlier that Dennis Gallagher was an institution and that they don't make them anymore like him. But may we all try, and may we all do our best to live a life and to do the work on behalf of the people in the way that he taught us how to do. Thank you, Mr. President. I renew my motion for the adoption of Senate Joint Memorial 3, and I request a roll call vote.
The motion is the adoption of Senate Joint Memorial 3. Will the clerk please poll the members?
Senators Baisley. Baisley, aye. Bridges. Bridges, aye. Buckner. Buckner, aye. Coleman. Coleman, aye. Cutter. Cutter, aye. Danielson. Danielson, aye. Exum. Exum, aye. Fields. Fields, aye. Gardner. Gardner, aye. Janal. Janal, aye. Gonzalez. Gonzalez, aye. Hanson. Hanson, aye. Hinrichsen. Hinrichsen, aye. Jaquez Lewis. Jaquez Lewis, aye. Kirkmeyer. Kirkmeyer, aye. Kolker. Kolker, aye. Liston. Liston, aye. Lundin. Lundin, aye. Marchman excused. Moreno. Moreno, aye. Mullica. Mullica, aye. Pelton B. Pelton B, aye. Pelton R. Pelton R, aye. Priola. Priola, aye. Rich. Rich, aye. Roberts. Roberts, aye. Rodriguez. Rodriguez, aye. Simpson. Simpson, aye. Smallwood. Smallwood, aye. Sullivan. Sullivan, aye. Van Winkle. Van Winkle, aye. Will. Will, aye. Winter. Winter, aye. Zenzinger. Zenzinger, aye. Blickensderfer. Blickensderfer, aye. Hernandez. Hernandez, aye. Sandoval. Sandoval, aye. Tate. Tate, aye. Mr. President. President, aye.
With a vote of 34 ayes, 0 noes, 0 absent, 1 excused, Senate Joint Memorial 3 is adopted. Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. President. I request that the current roll call be added as co-sponsors.
Seeing no objection, the current roll call will be added as co-sponsors. The Senate will now observe a moment of silence in memory of Senator Gallagher. Thank you to all the guests, the family, friends who joined us today to honor the life and legend of Dennis Gallagher. The Senate will now stand in a brief recess to greet our guests.